So I'm going to briefly review some of what I told you last time, and then I'm going to walk through, as I mentioned, I'm going to walk through the Disney film Pinocchio, and which I presume most of you have seen. How many of you have seen it? Yeah, okay, well that's so as I think I mentioned, that's something in and of itself, right? I mean, the fact that you've all seen it means that it's a production of cultural significance, and because it's such a strange artifact, that's one way of looking at it, it might be worth trying to take it apart to understand why it is, for example, that you even understand it. And so I offered you the proposition last week that we view the world essentially through a narrative lens, and I believe that we view the world through a narrative lens because the fundamental problem that we have to solve as living creatures is how we should act in the world. And that means how we should act to maintain ourselves, but also how we need to act in relationship to other people and in relationship to the broader world in order to maintain ourselves across time. So that's a complicated problem, right? It's not just how you survive, it's how you survive now and next week and next month and next year and 50 years from now, and maybe your descendants as well, if the culture is going to stabilize, and then not only you across all those time frames, but you and everyone else across all those time frames. It's a viciously difficult problem. And so I would say that we have evolved mechanisms to solve that. I think that's self-evident in some sense because, for example, one of the mechanisms that animals have evolved to deal with the problem of social being, even if they're not particularly social animals, is the dominance hierarchy, right? Or you could call it a hierarchy of authority or power, because I think considering human structures, social structures, as mere power structures is a terrible mistake. It's a terrible oversimplification, because power is by no means the only, like force is what I mean. Force is not a stable way of solving the problem of how to live together across time. The question is, what is the stable way of solving how to live together across time? And that really is the question, and it's part of the question that I'm trying to answer, partly because it's a perennial problem, right? We face the problem of how to organize ourselves in small social units without undue conflict, and then we face the larger problem of how to organize ourselves into large social units without undue conflict, and that conflict can be absolutely devastating and frequently is. So then I would also say that the first way of solving this problem isn't conscious, you see, not at all. And you know, you may know and you may not know that there are different forms of memory, right? Really technically different forms of memory. So for example, there's short-term working memory, which is the memory that you use to hold things like telephone numbers in your active imagination. It decays very rapidly. It's only about 4 to 7 bits, which is why, well, it's why phone numbers were at least 7 digits long. You know, you can kind of manage that as a loop. And then there's episodic memory, and that has two elements. One is semantic and the other is episodic. It's what's the name of that? Someone said something? Yes, well, there's procedural memory, and then there's another, the kind of memory that you use to represent your experiences to yourself. So let's say it's image laden, and the other one is semantic, and semantic is your memory for facts, and those are quite different. So for example, procedural memory, that's how you ride a bike, that's how you play the piano, that's how you play jazz music if you're in a combo. It's the memory, it's a funny kind of memory because it's actually built right into you, you know. I mean, so is the kind of memory that you use to represent your own life, but it's much more malleable in some sense. So what that means is that in your procedures there is information that you don't know about. It's patterned information that you don't know about. Part of that is how to act. You know, like when you walk into a social gathering, you don't really think through how you're going to act. You know how to act. And if someone asked you, exactly what it is that you're doing and why. You could formulate a story about it, but the probability that it's the existence of that story that enabled you to act that way is zero, because you have to react way faster than that. And so, you know, you have social knowledge built into your nervous system because you've practiced being a social being for a very long period of time. And of course then that social being has been shaped for forever, really. And it's the right way of thinking about it. You know, we know that animals organize themselves into hierarchies, and we'll say of dominance, because it's more true the farther back you go in time, at least since the time of the crustaceans, you know, when we split from our common ancestor 300 million years ago. And it's true for social animals and non-social animals. So even animals that don't live together in groups have to organize themselves into a hierarchy in the space they inhabit. Songbirds are a good example, and they have dominance disputes all the time. Partly that's, you can hear them having their little dominance disputes in the spring when they're singing, because basically what they're singing is, I'm pretty damn healthy and I'm ready to go, and if you're another bird like me, you better steer clear of this tree. And the dominant songbirds, you know, they don't live together. Crows are social, but most songbirds aren't. The dominant songbirds get the best nest, and the best nest is the one that doesn't get rained on, and it's not too windy, and it's close to food sources, and you know, and so then they have the healthiest chicks, and they attract the best mates. And like, it's really important where you're positioned in the hierarchy, even if you're not like a flock or herd creature. Now we're more like herd creatures, so it's even more relevant to us. But there's just no escaping a hierarchical arrangement in social being. That is social being, and it's evolutionarily ancient beyond conception. So 300 million years ago there weren't trees, you know, I mean, so the dominance hierarchy is older than trees. So that's really something to think about. And then, you know, when you're thinking about the reality that shaped us, say from an evolutionary perspective, but also from a cultural perspective, what you have to understand is that the things that have shaped us most are the things that have been around the longest. And so you could say those are the most real things. And you can't even see some of them. Like, it's not like you can come in here, well, it's not exactly true. You can't come in here and see the multiple dominance hierarchies that are at work. You can in a way, because the chairs are set up to face this way and I'm facing that way, and that gives you some clues about the social order here, and you take the cues instantly, right? You come down, you sit in the chairs, you organize yourselves according to mutual expectation, and that's part of your procedural knowledge about how to behave as a social creature. Now, that knowledge is really, really deep, and a lot of it's coded in your behavior. Now, and in other people's behavior as well. And that's, you know, that's the expectations you have of other people and of yourself. And a lot of those are implicit, right? So when we're interacting, there's a very large number of things that you just don't get to do. And you know that too. And you won't do them. And that way we can act as if we understand each other, even though we don't, because you're really complicated and I'm really complicated. And there's lots of situations where we might really be in conflict. But because we share a map of the culture, the cultural expectations, it makes part of our, it's built right into our perception. You will act out that set of expectations, and so will I. And if neither of us can do that, even if one of us can't, we're either going to immediately devolve into conflict, or we're going to avoid each other like the plague. And that's exactly the right thing to do. And so one of the really useful things to understand, and this took me a long time to formulate properly, you know, you hear the terror management theorists, for example, and they have this idea that your meaning representation, the story you tell about the world, regulates your death anxiety. It's something like that. But that's not right. I mean, it's close to right, and it's a smart idea. It came from Ernest Becker, by the way, who wrote a book called The Denial of Death, which is actually quite a good book, even though it's wrong. You know, sometimes a book can be very useful. It can be usefully wrong, and Becker's book is usefully wrong, because he thought that it's the internal representation of your belief system that regulates your anxiety, and that anxiety is fundamentally, in the final analysis, anxiety about death. It's like, well, okay, fine, it's a reasonable proposition, but that isn't how it works, you see. It isn't my beliefs right now that are regulating my emotion. It's the fact that I'm acting out those beliefs, which include implicit perceptions. I'm acting them out, and so are you. And so what you're doing and what I expect, more accurately, what you're doing and what I want you to do, and the way I want you to react to me, that's working. So it's the match between my belief system and the way everyone else is acting that's regulating my emotions. It's not the belief system. It's mediated by the social culture. And you see, if you understand this, then you understand more particularly why people are willing to fight to the bitter end to protect their culture. It's not a psychological structure that they're protecting. It's a psychological structure and a sociological structure simultaneously. So the social contract is, you have a set of expectations and I have a set of expectations. They're actually desires. They're not merely expectations, because as living creatures we're desirous. We don't just expect. And so you desire an outcome and I desire an outcome. And we agree to act in accordance with that. That's the social contract. And so people don't like having that disrupted. Well, it isn't because it psychologically destabilizes them, although it does. It's because it actually destabilizes them. Right? If all of a sudden we can't occupy the same specified domain of territory, it isn't only that we're thrown into psychological disarray, although we will be, it's that we'll start fighting with each other, like, and that can kill you. It's no joke. It kills people a lot. Like, it can happen very easily that a cohesive social group can fragment along some fracture line of identity, let's say, and all hell breaks loose. You know, that's what happened with the Tutsis and the Hutu in Rwanda, you know, and those things can get out of control just so fast. It's just unbelievable. And that wasn't death anxiety, that was death. That's a whole different thing. And that's the other thing the terror management people don't exactly get. It's like, it isn't just that your culture and your cultural beliefs protect you from anxiety, and say anxiety about death even. It's that they actually protect you from death as well as protecting you from death anxiety. I mean, look, it's warm in here, it's cold outside. The fact that the culture is intact means that you're not outside freezing. That's a hell of a lot more fundamental in some sense than mere anxiety, although I'm not trying to underplay the role of anxiety. That's a major issue, but there's something that's a lot more fundamental at stake than mere psychology. So it's the match between your map of the world and other people's actions that regulates your emotion. And it regulates it completely, because, you know, if someone in here started acting seriously deranged, like brandished a pistol, let's say, all of a sudden you would not be in the same place at all, not a bit. And so what would happen? Well, chaos would happen. And chaos isn't just that you would get anxious. That's not a good enough explanation. What would happen is more complex than that. What happens in some sense is that your body, and it does this, what would happen is that you would react the same way that a rat reacts to a cat. It's exactly that. It's exactly that. You would respond as if a terrible predator had emerged in your midst. And so what is that reaction? Well, it's not just anxiety, because when you encounter a predator, anxiety isn't the only thing that's useful. That just makes you freeze. It's like, that could be the worst thing you could do. You freeze and, well, you're a pretty easy target. So you have to be prepared for a lot broader range of responses than mere petrification. Like, how about a little aggression? That might be helpful. You don't know, it also might get you killed, but, you know, maybe you can take the guy down, and maybe that's a good idea, you know, and maybe you have to run, so that's disinhibited as well, and maybe you have to think really quickly and reflexively, so that happens, that's activated, disinhibited, I would say, as well. It's like your whole being is thrown into intense concentration on the moment, and you're burning up physiological resources like mad. And so what will happen after something like that, if you don't develop outright post-traumatic stress disorder, which some of you would, is that you'd, assuming that the situation was brought under control, you'd walk out of here shaking with your heart rate at like 170, and it would take you like, well, it might take you the rest of your life, and maybe you would never recover, but you could bloody well be sure that it would take you the rest of the day, that's for sure. And so It's no joke when someone steps outside the confines of the social contract.